What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. Today I'll be going over some wide receivers who have been a bit unlucky this season that we might want to buy low on, but for the most part I'll be touching on the different wide receivers you guys asked for an updated take on. Before we do that though, have to start things off with the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat was among the top 15 running backs in half PPR scoring this last week. Only one of them did not score a touchdown. I asked, who was it? And the answer is Kareem Hunt, and then Dalvin Cook did it as well on Monday night, and so Twizzler and Lumpnums were the first to guess those two right. Today's stat, just one wide receiver ranks in the top 15 in half PPR scoring, and also ranks outside of the top 45 wide receivers in air yards per game. Who is it? And think about how this could happen. You know, how could a wide receiver not see many deep targets, but rack up a lot of fantasy points? All right, let's start off with two potential buy lows. There really aren't that many this week. There's not many wide receivers that are getting a ton of air yards, a ton of targets, but not many fantasy points per game. At this point, a lot of things have stabilized, and so there's two we're going to talk about. And actually, this first one, AJ Brown, it's not even that the air yards and targets aren't there. It's literally just that he is an absolute monster. He has the weekly upside we're looking for in the playoffs, and he's coming off one reception for 21 yards. And so he's a player that whenever he does dip, because he has a little bit of variance to his game, whenever he does dip, we want to go after him. And also, we watched that game, he did drop a long touchdown pass. And if that gets caught, it's a completely different narrative. And so he had like 6 touchdowns over the previous 5 weeks. He was bound to have a dip in production. I'm not saying that this kid is going to be cheap in the trade market. But if the person who owns them is a little bit upset with the performance, or if they need to change their team, because there are going to be teams that at this point can't lose, right? I mean, there are plenty of teams out there that have maybe 3 or 4 wins right now. If you have that, you're probably in trouble, but you can win or make it into the playoffs going 7-6. And so if these teams want to make the playoffs, they got to win out. Remind teams of that. Remind the owner of AJ Brown, if he's got 3 or 4 wins, they need to win out. Maybe they're struggling in a different position. Maybe they have people on bye. You go after AJ Brown. Maybe after this performance, it's a little bit easier to get him. Unfortunately, his next 2 matchups are pretty tough. But if you're doing trades, you got to kind of get it done this week, because I don't know what the trade deadline is in your league, but typically in a lot of leagues, it's around the week of Thanksgiving. So sometime very soon will be the trade deadline. Again, depends on the format. Your league could just do things differently, so check that in the settings. But it's around Thanksgiving time, and Thanksgiving is right around the corner. So in this next 2 weeks, he faces the Ravens this coming week, and then he's got the Colts again in week 12, and he just dudded against them this last time. But after that, he gets 3 really soft matchups in a row. He plays the Browns, the Jaguars, the Lions, all really teams that we're looking to attack through the air. And so since those matchups also come in 3 very important weeks for fantasy, he is, like I said, a really nice player to target if you need an upgrade at wide receiver 2. I would say that I wouldn't love AJ Brown as my wide receiver 1 on a championship team, but as my wide receiver 2, because of the weekly ceiling that he has, that's really nice. Also, kind of speaking about that, I've added a table on the website. I know trading is basically done this season, so it's going to be more helpful next season, but a lot of you ask, okay, but what do I give up to acquire this new player? I've kind of created like a tier system that uses rest of season value, but then breaks them off into tiers. And so basically it would be, I want to get as many players in this top tier as I can. The top tier only has like 10 players because these are just the most valuable pieces, but you're trying to get as many people in the top tiers as possible. And so I'd be willing to take maybe 2 players from tier 8 and trade for 1 player in tier 9. I don't know exactly how it's going to work. You can just read it on the website. There's going to be a little bit of a write-up before the table explaining how you would use it, but that's the idea. It's, okay, I've got a player in tier 6 and tier 7. can I package them and then maybe another tier 6 player for a tier 8 player? It's something like that, to where you have some sort of value to know, okay, he's a wide receiver 2, but what tier does he fall into? So rest of season, I do have A.J. Brown as a wide receiver 13. He goes into the 3rd best tier, so not the super elite players, not in that tier right below. He's in that 3rd one, so that kind of gives you some sort of range. And I guess look at the table, take 2 players from a tier below, trade for A.J. Brown. So I hope that kind of makes sense. It'll make more sense if you just look at the table I'm talking about. But if you don't want to look at it, rest of season, wide receiver 13, that's where I value A.J. Brown. Realistically, the only other buy low right now is Jeudy. He ranks 23rd in targets per game, 4th in air yards per game, which is nuts, and then 45th in fantasy points per game. He's pretty clearly the only player that isn't dust, because AJ Green ranks high in this, but he's dust. The only player that's really high on both of these categories just isn't producing in fantasy. It's basically because he has 2 touchdowns on the year, and whenever you have very few touchdowns, it's difficult to produce in fantasy. But remember what we went over earlier in the year. Rookie wide receivers typically do not break out until the second half of the season. You don't typically see rookies come out in weeks 1, 2, 3 and just dominate from the start. And we've been going over Jeudy's volume for a while now. He's seeing a crazy amount of targets and air yards, especially for a rookie, and he's going to have a blow-up game at some point. He did sort of blow up against the Falcons, and it wasn't a great idea to trade for him right after that, because whenever a rookie has a monster performance like that, that's not when you buy high. That doesn't make any sense. But he dipped down this past week, so we can target him again. I do want to note that a lot of that production against the Falcons did come in garbage time, but you know what? That's going to happen to the Broncos because they're not that great of a team. And he is averaging nearly 11 targets per game over these last 3 weeks. And again, he is 4th in air yards per game on the season. That's absolutely crazy. So I know the majority of you already have him because we were just early in the season, like you got to get him every single week when he was on free agency even, saying trade for him. So I know a lot of you have him, but if you don't have him yet, I do think it's a good idea to go out and get him. But like I said, that's kind of it for buy lows. No one else really stands out as underperforming in terms of air yards and targets. Things have really stabilized, and so there are no other big opportunities. Remember, we're not always trying to buy low. Sometimes you just want to buy. When we have a really good player who's producing in fantasy, just get them. I don't need to buy them at a dip in their value, just acquire them in some way. So that's why I'm trying to add this new table, just so you have some sort of reference of where people are valued in tiers and what you could give up to get them. All right, let's go over some of your questions now. And the first one up is probably on a lot of your minds, and it's what is wrong with Michael Thomas? You know, he played 55% of the snaps in week 9 in his return, gaining 5 for 51. So you look at that and you're like, okay, he played half the snaps in a game that was a blowout for a large portion of the game. He's working his way back from injury. When you play half the snaps, 5 for 50, I mean, that's basically what we should expect, right? We don't expect him to come back and play 100% of the snaps, especially in a blowout. And getting 5 for 50 on about half the snaps is solid. Okay. Then we move into this week, and he plays 78% of the snaps. And you're like, okay, what did he jump up to, like 7 for 70? No. He had 2 receptions for 27 yards on 7 targets. And then we see after the game, Drew Brees has a fractured rib, or I guess multiple fractured ribs, and a collapsed lung. So he's going to miss some time. It has not come out exactly how long he's going to miss. It obviously depends on his recovery, but he's going to miss multiple weeks. It's very likely that's going to happen. And that could be very, very bad news for Michael Thomas, and it could be catastrophic if Taysom Hill is named the starter and starts over Winston for an extended period of time. I do not know when this decision is going to come out. I think they said midweek, but I mean, it's up to them. They don't have to announce it if they don't want to, and if they don't want to give away their game plan for the week, they might not release this. I would say at the very least, even if Winston's named the quarterback, Taysom Hill's going to get work. And if you own any of the wide receivers, or I guess Jared Cook as well, for the Saints, you don't want Taysom Hill at quarterback. He's going to run the ball a lot. He's not Drew Brees. Like, he's not going to be overly aggressive. I think that's a very, very big decision that the Saints need to make. Do they go with Jameis Winston? Do they go with Taysom Hill? But if you own these skill players, you want it to be Winston. Now, here's also the problem. Winston is still not Drew Brees. And I know that is obvious, but think back to Mike Evans and Godwin. When they lose Winston, it actually doesn't hurt their value that much, because they were players where they were gaining so much of their value in garbage time because Winston screwed up games and they had to throw it a lot. But then also just because Winston was so aggressive downfield that they had so many big plays. Well, that's not Drew Brees, and that's not where Michael Thomas gets his value. Michael Thomas doesn't get his value because you're being overly aggressive deep downfield. He gets his value because he had 15 targets that all came within 10 yards of the line of scrimmage on a really short route. But when you rack up 12 receptions, you're going to approach 100 yards. You're going to be used in the red zone when you have this shallow A-dot. And so that's how he broke the receptions record last season and how he performed so well in fantasy. But when you transition away from someone like Brees, who feeds off of those routes, into Winston, that hurts because he's not the type of player who excels under Winston, and especially under Taysom Hill, because Hill's going to run so much. Even if they have a similar amount of dropbacks, they're not going to result in pass attempts as often. And so this really does hurt him. I honestly don't know where to rank him rest of season. I mean, it's a very difficult decision. Right now, I'm assuming Winston will be named the starter. I think that's most likely, but then that they will use Taysom Hill a lot more than they have been. And because that's how I think it'll come down, I have Michael Thomas as a mid-range wide receiver 2 right now. But if you're watching this and Taysom Hill is ruled the starter, I think that bumps him down rest of season a little bit more, because we would have to assume they would stick with him. I guess we don't know. For this week, though, they played the Falcons. That's a really nice matchup. I don't think you're benching Michael Thomas. I definitely think if you got him, unless you've got multiple wide receiver 1s and 2s that you feel good about, I would play him against the Falcons. They are a team where you should lean more pass heavy. They are a team that should keep pace, should challenge them. The Saints are still favored, but it's only by 4.5 points, at least as of recording this. And so it should be a relatively close game. And so you have to think, whoever the quarterback is in this matchup, this game environment, Michael Thomas is going to be solid. And so if you've got him, I'd be playing him this week. And then if he doesn't produce again and we see some very bad signs about his usage, we'll reevaluate next week. But I think this week, given the matchup, you got to be playing him. Next up, you guys want to know about some rookies. So you asked about Justin Jefferson, Jerry Jeudy, and T. Higgins. I already went over Jerry Jeudy, but to reiterate, he is seeing great volume. He is extremely talented, so he is going to continue to be a buy whenever you can get him, as long as you're not giving up a ton. As for the other two, you really can't trade for them after their explosions last week. Like I mentioned, when you have a rookie that just goes off and, was a first or second, I guess, round pick in T. Higgins, but it was the first pick in the second round. When they're a very high pick, there's a lot of hype around them, and then they explode. That's not when you trade for them. You trade for them after the bad weeks. But these two were buy lows for the first 2 months of the season. Every single week we were talking about them. And so I think a lot of you are out there wondering, okay, I have both of these guys, sitting on my bench, and I'm not necessarily starting them every week, but should I be? We said all summer that this was one of the best wide receiver draft classes in a very long time. And so with these guys in the first round, they're not all going to hit, but some of them were very likely to hit. And it looks like T. Higgins and Justin Jefferson are two that are going to be, and basically already are, high-end wide receiver talents in fantasy football. And so if you've got them just sitting on your bench, you should be playing them pretty much every week. I'll say Jefferson has a lower floor because of the offense that he's on. The Vikings definitely have game scripts where when they get ahead by 2 scores, they're running the ball every play. And so you don't necessarily need to start Jefferson every week if you think it's not going to be there for the volume. But also, he's one of basically 2 wide receivers that they use, and so he needs the volume to be very low to just be not worth the start. And so if you've got these guys on your bench, this is what I've done. At least I have these players on my bench. I had Ayuk as well, Claypool in some leagues. Trades. You don't trade them away. We're basically comfortable playing this tier of players. Whoever you have at the starters, use them to upgrade positions. Use them to upgrade running back, tight end, quarterback, maybe other wide receivers, because these rookies to close the season are going to be good in fantasy, and so there's no use in having a bunch of them on your bench. I feel good moving forward about Justin Jefferson, T. Higgins, Brandon Ayuk, Chase Claypool, and Jeudy. It's differing levels of comfort, but if you needed to start all of those guys or like someone in that list every week moving forward, I'm cool with that, as long as, it's not a brutal matchup or like, gale force winds like we've seen recently. In general, I'm cool starting those guys. Then you have the tier of Jalen Reagor, Michael Pittman, and CeeDee Lamb. Lamb was a weekly must start before the Dak injury, but that obviously hurt his value. And so I think that if these three have really good matchups over this last month plus, then I don't think they're must starts, but I wouldn't feel really, really bad about my team if, again, in a really good matchup, you're starting one of those three. After that, it becomes more speculative. So the rookies like Darnell Mooney, Denzel Mims, Henry Ruggs, Laviska Shenault, KJ Hamler, those guys all have a lot of talent. They have the potential, even this season, to have opportunity flow their way and be starters down the stretch. But as of right now, I would not feel great starting that group of players. One or two of them could break out, but I really think that for this group, their time is in future seasons and not 2020. That is not to say they cannot produce, especially if there's an injury that's really going to help this group, but I wouldn't feel great about them. The other two groups, you heard my take on them. The first one, I feel good every week, basically. Second tier, kind of matchup dependent. This tier, wouldn't love it outside of deeper formats. So that's kind of how I value all the rookie wide receivers this season. Again, rookies typically don't break out until the second half. So they start breaking out right now. So when we have some of these guys like Jefferson and Higgins and Ayuk basically that have been producing before we transition into the later portion of the rookie season, that's a really good sign for their future in the league. You guys also asked for an update on Antonio Brown. He apparently threw a bike at a security guard and then destroyed the security camera. So nothing really out of the ordinary for Antonio Brown. This dispute was already settled, and so I don't expect anything to come of this. But it's a reminder that he makes very questionable decisions. We'll put it that way. And he could be suspended at any moment for doing something absolutely ridiculous that you wouldn't think any human being would do. Expect anything from Antonio Brown. We have no idea what is going through his brain. But he's also one of the most talented wide receivers in the league, and he is playing with Tom Brady. So there are a few things I want to go over with Antonio Brown. First, the risk. Realize that. Please realize that he could be suspended at any moment, and you can't be upset with that. You've got to know the risk going in with this. But I want to talk about his production in these first 2 weeks back. So his snap share went way down last week, and I'm sure that has a lot of people concerned. A lot of that was because of the game script. They were dominating for the majority of this game, which meant that they were running the ball a lot in the second half, and they weren't running as many 3 wide receiver sets. Well, Antonio Brown is only on the field when they run 3 wide receiver sets. He is not in 2 wide receiver sets. And so if they're only running 2 wide receivers, he's not going to be on the field. So that's a very important note. Also, if you watch the game, you noticed there were a lot of red zone packages he was just not in the game for. And even when they used 3 wide receivers, they used Tyler Johnson ahead of him a few times. Is that going to continue moving forward? I don't know. I don't coach the team. I'm not in that locker room. So it is possible that that role is going to increase, that they're going to be like, listen, AB, you don't know all the plays yet. You don't know some of our goal line stuff. In a few weeks, we're going to use you on all 3 wide receiver sets. So that could increase his value. But it's also worth noting, he's not playing in 2 wide receiver sets. And they run a lot of those plays and even 1 wide receiver sets in the red zone. So it's only Mike Evans on the field. And then it's only Mike Evans and Godwin and Gronk on the field. And so that hurts his value. So I actually don't think Antonio Brown has as much value moving forward as I thought before. It's a very minor decrease, but I think it's more his upside. I do not think, while Godwin and Mike Evans are healthy, after watching these first two games, that he has the same sort of upside I was hoping he would have. Because again, if he is playing behind Godwin and Mike Evans when there's two wide receivers on the field, that's a lot of plays where he just cannot get the football. And the Bucs are a good team. And if they're going to run the ball a lot in the second half and AB is going to be on the bench, well, you can't score fantasy points on the bench. So rest of season, I've moved Godwin from the wide receiver 17 to 15, Brown from wide receiver 21 to 22, very minor decrease, Evans, wide receiver 25 to 24. I think the bigger story here is that I was hoping Godwin and AB would move into like high-end wide receiver 2 numbers. I don't think that's going to be the case anymore. I think where I have them as mid to low-end wide receiver 2s is what we should expect on a weekly basis moving forward, which is unfortunate, but I guess not overly shocking. The last player I want to go over today is Robert Woods. He was in the perfect spot last week, and he did not produce. He has returned his draft capital this season, but it's definitely been a little bit disappointing. We were definitely hoping that he would exceed his draft capital and they would use him much more like they did over the second half of last season. But this offense is just in love with running the football, and since it's been working for them, there's no reason we're expecting them to stop. Josh Reynolds has also been emerging as part of this offense, and that's going to take target share away from Woods and Kupp. So Woods is the wide receiver 20 in points per game this season. I have him as the wide receiver 20 rest of season. I think he's going to continue to see 6 to 8 targets every week. Spikes from there, but not the same spikes that Cooper Kupp has been seeing. He's going to be, I would say, most weeks, 6 to 10. But on average, 6 to 8. And he's going to catch a lot of those. They're not going to come deep downfield, but that also means, he's not DK Metcalf. He's not going to have 8 targets, but turn that in to 5 receptions for 100 yards and a touchdown. If Woods has 8 targets, he's probably turning that into like 6 or 7 receptions, but only for 60 or 70 yards, and he doesn't have that same sort of touchdown upside. And so you got to realize targets are different for each player, but 20. He's a low-end wide receiver 2. I think, though, that if you can get him for roughly that price, I like him as a wide receiver 2 or low-end wide receiver 2 because Patriots, Jets, Seahawks. That's his playoff schedule. And even the 2 weeks before that, 49ers and Cardinals, those games should be relatively competitive, and so maybe the Rams won't be able to run the ball every play. But yeah, I guess overall, if you're wondering about Robert Woods, low-end wide receiver 2 with a really nice playoff schedule. It doesn't mean he's going to explode because, they just played Seattle and he didn't explode, but they're good matchups. And so if you've got a guy who's priced extremely fair, and he should have his best games to close the season, I guess that's good in the trade market. I don't think we're going out of our way anymore to trade for him because it's just very disappointing that they are running the ball as much as they are, doing that sort of rotation with the running backs, and it doesn't look like they're going to change. So even in those good matchups, is it possibly duds? Yes. And so don't go out of your way to trade everything to get Robert Woods, but he's priced very fairly. 20th in points per game, 20th rest of season in my rankings. I think you're getting a low-end wide receiver 2 when you trade for him. So I hope that was helpful to you guys. And again, if you have any other questions, then you can tweet them at me or leave them in the comment section of this video, and I will try to go over as many of those as possible in the Saturday video. But that's the end of this one. Hope you all did enjoy. If you did, then how about hitting that like button, and how about subscribing to the channel if you're new? Thanks for watching.